I'll talk a little bit about myself and then get right into the presentation. This would be my 16th year in information security, and about 13 of those I've worked as an auditor, starting off with some ISACA work I did quite a while ago. I still am active with the ISACA community. Anybody else here work with the ISACA or with ISA? Show of hands. Okay. How many auditors actually are in the audience? Show of hands if you do audit. What about engineering? Building, clouds, virtualized? Okay. Mostly engineering. I guess my first real work with virtualized environments was in '99 when I was building servers, trying to see what capacity we could get out of them in a financial data center. So I do have a technical background, but I'm going to focus on more of the compliance side from an audit perspective today. I'll try to balance, actually. Margaret Thatcher once said if you stand in the middle of the road, you get hit by traffic going both ways, which is kind of the dilemma of one of these presentations and actually working in compliance. So we'll try to talk about the technical aspects, but also the management and the audit compliance aspects, both at the same time. Also, I'd like to ask if you could reach under your seat and see if you have a raffle ticket. There's a ticket. No? Anybody find one? That's because there isn't a raffle ticket under your seat. Part of compliance is kind of funny. It's like, why do people do things that you tell them to do or not do them? I saw some people didn't even bother, right? Maybe it's because you respect authority. You thought, I'm a speaker, I might know what I'm talking about, so you'll do it. Or maybe it's because you think there's a fear of loss. If you don't do it, you might not get the money, which is like the same as opportunity. Here's your chance to win something. Of course, there was no ticket, so you have to ask yourself, what were you doing? And that's kind of what I'm going to talk about today, like what motivates people into a compliance posture, what really makes compliance successful in this new world of clouds. I'm Davi Ottenheimer. Jen Zen also worked with me on this presentation. He is the director of vCloud Solutions. I'm a consultant at VMware working on this, helping them build the compliance strategy around the new vCloud some of the announcements you heard today are a lot of the products I'm working on. So first, a disclaimer. They make me put this in. So we're talking about things that are under development. You've probably seen these before. Hopefully everyone knows or is familiar with the disclaimer slides. You also might not want to believe what I say after the lottery or the ticket question. So there are 4 sections to this presentation. I'm going to talk about managing risk first, after we do an overview really of the cloud situation. Then we'll talk about addressing concerns and then do some conclusions and strategies for how to get to compliance in this new world. So everybody hopefully is familiar with the cloud. Is anybody unfamiliar with the cloud and want to admit it in front of everybody else? The bottom line here is there are a lot of opportunities in the cloud environment which you can get yourself into. So most of the sales and marketing you will see will talk about things like elasticity, the efficiency, the consumption. This is a stock slide from VMware, and you notice it doesn't say cloud computing is really compliant or it's really secure. In the keynotes this morning, you might have seen security come up. I heard compliance mentioned a couple times. It wasn't the emphasis. So why is that? Why are they talking about this in terms of these great features? Is it because people don't see compliance as a strategic advantage? They don't see it as something which is brought by authority? Back again to the example of a raffle ticket. What makes compliance compelling? So in an overview sense, life before the cloud was your infrastructure, cost distributed throughout. You could see where it was going to cost you. The firewall was expensive. The IDS was expensive. All of the infrastructure was expensive. And then you move into a model where it's like you can pay for something. It's called the firewall. It's called, you can even see in the keynote, they're talking about these new product lines. So what are you getting really when you're buying for it? It's a service. And hopefully it is what they say it is, which creates a problem. There's a trust relationship you're now building with the person selling the service. So again, when we look at the VMware slide perspective, it's the private cloud on one side has agility and efficiency. Great. These are awesome things you can do when you get into a cloud. You get into a public side, you can do things like you have better choice and more compatibility. So VMware gives you these opportunities to move your virtualized infrastructure between private and public. You can get all sorts of cool things going, but they're still leaving out the discussion, which we're going to talk today about, which is where do you put the security and compliance? I got some resistance on this slide, which you might imagine, because I have a con side. And, I'm a consultant, so I'm coming from an outsider perspective, but I do work for VMware, and I do want to give you the straight answer here. Also, as a security professional, I feel it's my job. I try to keep things as independent as possible. So I'm not saying anything that hasn't been approved, obviously. There's no shocking news here. But words like specialized, or you might even say are contentious. What I mean by specialized with the star is that you can get into an environment where you think, am I locked in? Or you can get into an environment where you think, do I know what's really going on? Opaqueness. So you have to answer these questions. Compliance is a way to get there. So the real answer of this presentation at the end should be, where does the green compliance box go? If compliance is more on the con side, it's not specific to any one vendor. It's something you need to figure out for yourself when you're looking at a provider or when you're looking at cloud. Or another way of looking at this is, how do we address all the cons? Sort of a pun intended there. If you're walking blind into a cloud because they're just giving you this marketing spiel, where do you find the dog that's the seeing eye dog, right? You're blind, so who's going to lead you out of this? And I'll give you a couple strategies for how to do that. But first, let me address what I've found is marketing hype around security and compliance in the cloud. Two things I see often presented are commodity and size. People say the cloud gives you commodity, so obviously it's going to be more secure, more compliant, right? Who's going to be better at security than X provider who has billions and billions of users, hundreds of thousands of sessions already running? Who's going to know how to do security better, them or you? I see that in the news all the time. Another one is size, right? These guys are so huge, how could they do it wrong? Who would ever be too big to fail? The graphic here really illustrates kind of the new model of auto engineering too. I don't know if this wasn't intended to fit into the slide of the road, or the concept of the road that they're promoting, but it's actually the modern vision of security of a vehicle. When you look at engineering engines now, when you look at working on them and maintaining them as a mechanic, is very different than it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, right? You're not in there, you're not looking at the carburetor, you're not tuning, you're not messing with things the way you used to. In IT, more and more you're going to open the hood and see, wow, there's a diagnostic plug. How do I plug in my management console? So it's the same sort of thing that we're working on here. It's not like cloud is completely new in the world of security and compliance. There are other models outside we can look to. So let's first address commodity. I would say commodity doesn't automatically give you safety. Now, Bruce Greenwald says, in the long run, everything gets commoditized. He's famous for saying, if you look at the market over time, everything turns into a toaster. So let's look at the toaster. It's a really awesome example because it actually is not that safe, right? It took 54 years, I don't think a lot of people realize, for the toaster to really become safe. Since it was really invented, as you will, people used to just put the bread right on the flame, right, with a piece of wire. So the electric toaster was made safe by a receptacle called the GFCI, which is a ground fault interrupter. So another concept here is to think, what protects you? Or if you're commoditizing technology, is it something outside the technology which gives you that level of protection? Which, in the case of a virtualized instance, if you put your instance into a cloud or if you move it private, public, maybe there's something else, like vShield, which is different than the actual instance, which gives you security. So you can see here the development over time. I've listed out some of the major changes. But I would not expect cloud tomorrow to have some of these things. Maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years, you'll start to see more GFCI-type solutions. So Michael Schrage actually also calls this the myth of commoditization. On the bottom right, it might be hard to see, but this is the hot dog toaster. He says that in commoditization, you still get specialization. So even though you work towards commoditization, you might end up with something which is just for the hot dog. So commoditization still has a lot of risks. There's always new inventions, there's always change. The other thing to keep in mind is size. When you look at the way that people might present safety, this is, strangely enough, a whale-shaped graph at the top, and there's the Twitter whale, which you might be familiar with. Even size for a lot of these providers has created failures. That top graph is the Google Lapse, which was mapped by Arbor. Arbor was monitoring all the traffic in the world, and they say here, this is when Google went dead for a period of time. And I've listed out some of the examples here where you can see even 6 days of outage for a service is pretty severe. So size is not going to get you what you want. Commoditization is not going to get you what you want. Another way of looking at size is just the massive amount of auditing you have to do when you get into a much larger environment. It's not to say it's impossible, but if you paint the Golden Gate Bridge, it takes you a while to get to the other end, and by the time you're done, you start over. So it actually has its own risks. Regional overlap's a big one. Localization. Some people say security, when you move into a large enough environment, just becomes all location. You might have seen the recent announcement about FISMA compliance, right? RSA is talking about a new product that will tell you the exact location of your virtualized instance in a cloud because you don't want it to leave the country. So now you can track it to make sure it never leaves the physical boundaries of a country. Very important if you have to prove that it was never in the jurisdiction of a foreign country. And vice versa. A lot of European states never want their stuff to touch the United States because of the different privacy laws. So size can actually mean something that's more risk rather than less risk if you get into the true compliance requirements that you have to deal with. You also might have more chances of eavesdropping or hypervisor hopping as an attack. The more hypervisors you have, perhaps, the more people on other hypervisors might try to get onto yours. So all sorts of new attack vectors when you get into size. It doesn't mean it's going to be safer just because it's bigger. So the question is, when does this cloud really make safe toast? Right? So let me take two approaches to answer this question. Anybody here ride a motorcycle? How many people have read Zen in the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Okay, not bad. In a nutshell, this is my Cliff's Notes version, there are two approaches to quality, which I'll transpose into security. When you're trying to get to security in a cloud, you can take the approach of the classical person who focuses on the details of the bike and tries to use analysis to solve problems. So you really get to know everything about your environment. You might be the type of auditor or the type of engineer who will get into the details of your environment to understand if it's compliant or not. The romantic approach is where you hire somebody, third-party auditing firm, a mechanic to do the work on your bike for you. If you read the book, there's a lot of passages where the author is listening to his engine and looking at the carburetors to see what color they are, to see if he should tune them based on air, intake, all sorts of things, gas. Whereas his partner is riding a BMW motorcycle where he's just saying, if there's a problem, I'm going to drop it off at the mechanic, and then I'll have a nice day in a hotel, and when it's done, I'll pick it up and ride again. So these are the two approaches. Either one is fine, but I want to make the distinction because I think people confuse them a lot of times and think if you don't get details, you can't be compliant, or if you don't get a management interface, you aren't getting the true story. I would say there are two approaches here. So the first approach is if you look at risk, you want to know first, where's your data in the cloud? You want to know the age of that data, whether it's being wiped properly. You want to know location, like I talked about the different countries, and FSMA compliance is one example. You want control test documentation. This is standard ISACA language, so you go in with a COBIT or you go in with an ISO. We'll talk about that in detail in a second. But you really want documentation of which controls are being used. Then you want to see the audit trails and the archives of all of the audits over time. And then you want reports, so you can see regular reports of status. But before you get to reports, you still want to know those first three things. So if you're going to get to compliance in a cloud, you're going to use this approach. Kind of the where's the beef. On the other hand, if you use a romantic approach, you might just take a formula and say, at the end of the day, I want to know if you're meeting my needs. I have wants too, but as long as you're meeting my needs, I'm going to be satisfied with cloud compliance. So at the end of the day, either way, you use romantic or classical, you're really going to end up with a checklist. You really can't avoid it. And so I'm going to talk about the ISO a lot today. We'll talk about other compliance standards. Notably absent from this, you might see, is the CSA. Anybody here representing the CSA, Cloud Security Alliance? Anybody download their matrix and use it? No. Well, I'm not a proponent, or I'm not going to say pros or cons for the CSA. I'll just say I would say an independent perspective, you already have 4 checklists here. Maybe you're trying to comply with NIST. Maybe you're trying to do HIPAA compliance and SOX. The CSA has added another line called the CSA checklist and another line of description, which if you apply theirs, you can then map back to these 4. And I don't see the value thus far in that approach. There may be value, but if you add another line, I would think it's because, back to my example at the very beginning, you're going to reach under your seat for a reason. And what's that reason you're going to use another checklist? Is there opportunity? Is there respect for authority? Why are you complying with that? What is it going to get you? So let's talk about managing risk. ISO 27005 has taken the risk formula that we used to use a lot in security community and audits and made it a formal document. So this is R, risk, is equal to vulnerabilities, V, times threats, times assets, and then countermeasures divided. So if we look at just vulnerabilities in the cloud first, we'll talk about how that impacts risk. So a long time ago, I'd say about 10 years ago, I was working on some early cloud assessments. And the first thing I noticed was I could not get the firewall rules. I wanted to know how vulnerable my clients were, and I was doing a penetration test for them, but I simply could not get them. They would say, you can test all you want from the outside, run pen tests, attack our firewalls. But to save time, a lot of times, or just to do an audit, you want to see the firewall rules. And in the cloud environment, they say no. You can only see your section, which would be like 3 lines out of 1,000 lines, which obviously doesn't wash. Back then, it was like an impossible conversation. Today, this has changed significantly, but the risk is still the same. If you're in an environment where you're sharing rules or you're sharing different types of security settings with other people, you have to see the other rules as long as they impact you. If you can prove they don't impact you, then that's a different story. But if they do impact you, that's the burden of proof. So a lot of times what we used to see on the right side is, here are your rules, and then there are these unknown rules, which could be an allow all, which could still impact your environment. So testing is really critical here. The virtualized world and the cloud world introduces things like duplicate IPs, much more so than elsewhere. So you can see like a 192.168 non-addressable is the same as another company which is right next to you. So if they're trying to hit their 192.168, suddenly they start seeing your servers because of a firewall rule that's made improperly. So the impact is much higher because of the shared environments. That's why it's so key to look at these vulnerabilities from a new perspective. Stateful is also important here. Stateful firewalls remember who initiated contact, so they know if you're a client or a server. So you can't just go with ACLs, you can't just go with VLANs. You need something which really understands who's talking to whom and for what reason. The more detail, the better. Again, because if you get into a mixed environment with lots of different devices, you can end up with a lot of devices that are able to bypass rules because it's not asking them anything except what's your IP address. That's not sufficient. You need more controls. So stateful is another level of control for vulnerabilities. Another test you might consider is remote access. The interesting thing about remote access to me, especially in a cloud environment, is how nothing's changed really, although we might approach it as something from a risk perspective, which is a more important vulnerability. This is because when you are vulnerable to an attack to your management interface in the cloud environment, it's way more powerful than if it was in a regular environment. Take power, for example. It used to be that you had to have physical access to walk in someplace, pull the power plug. So as an auditor, you might say, I want data center compliance, so keep people out of my data center, badge readers, blah, 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 a list of controls to keep people from going in and causing an availability outage. Now, somebody can, from anywhere in the world, connect to a management interface and click a power button. Do you have a trail of who they were, how they got there? All those things suddenly evaporate unless you have controls around this power button concept. So remote access becomes much more of a vulnerability, even though it's the same thing. It's HTTPS, it's SSH, you're auditing the same thing, but from a very different vulnerability perspective. So another test, logs. I do a lot of this work right now. We're basically setting a new standard for the log environment you will get. So if you're in a VMware environment now, we hope to give you a rich level of detail around the logs so that you can do proper auditing and control tests for compliance. You want things like a retention period, so you want to be able to use a service that you can keep for at least a year, right? SOX is a year, PCI is a year, 3 months minimum, but a year of retention. Some HIPAA examples are up to 21 years when you talk about minors. So you can have some pretty severe retention requirements. Access to the logs, integrity of the logs, right? You want to be able to be sure that they're not lossy, which means syslog, for example, used to be a lot of UDP traffic. So you'd be pounding a server and eventually it would just say, I don't really have time to take in all these logs. And you're turning up logs because you want to get more detail. And then at the same time, it's disconnecting and saying, I can't take it. So it drops all of your logs and you don't get good integrity. You don't know what you're missing. Confidentiality of the logs, super critical, because as you see again, you have duplicate IPs, you might have private domains or VLANs you're trying to hide from your competitors. Another example, I was in an audit situation where two competitors for hardware, they were literally competing with each other on the market, were sharing a virtualized space, this was many years ago, and our test was to see if we could get from one system into the other, and we could, just because the way it was configured. But that wasn't the concern. We could fix that. The bigger concern was that nobody noticed. So the logs have to tell you that somebody has accessed successfully as well as failure. Most people turn on failure logging, how many people are attempting to get in. A lot of times they don't turn on success logging. So the emphasis now in a cloud is even success, because if people get into the environment, you need to know, because maybe they're coming from somewhere else, they shouldn't be coming into your environment, and they're successful. And I can give you a lot of breach statistics around breaches that were based on remote access from VPN based on success. So Walmart is one example. When they came out and said, this attacker was coming in for 3 months successfully through the VPN. No one detected it because they were just successfully coming in through the VPN, right? But that vulnerability turned into a massive compliance issue where they had to give a breach notification, a lot of issues around what access did they have to data, how sensitive was it, and so forth. All right, so you also end up with the different audit trails you want to keep separate. So The idea being that ultimately you should be able to gather all your data, have it unique to your instance or to your data center if it's virtualized, or a cloud data center, and then download it or put it someplace else. If you keep it in the cloud, I think that's one strategy, but that might not be sufficient if you have auditors coming and asking you for that detail, and that cloud provider goes out of business, for example. So they go out of business, who owns that data? If you download it, you might have a better strategy for compliance. These are things that are still being sorted out, so I don't claim to have the answer. So threats. We talked about some vulnerability examples. How have threats changed from a compliance standpoint within the cloud environment, or how are they the same? If you work with the ISO, you know about threat modeling. It's sort of the standard beginning to any sort of risk management practice. You have to first understand your attackers and the paths they're using. So you model out who might be coming and how they might be getting in. Here's an example of what you might do. You might say, we're going to map the commitment and resources on 3 levels. You'll probably use more than 3, but just for illustration, you can say the commitment can be pretty high, they can be pretty stealthy, they'll work for a long time, they have an organized approach to the attack, right? And they have good resources available to them. So you get these threats mapped out to figure out who's coming in, and then you look at the paths they might be using. Remember the vulnerabilities? So you're mapping now who's attacking you back into how they're getting into your environment. So it's the foundation of the compliance strategy. That should allow you to do something like this, where you get a threat map that tells you probability versus impact, what should you really be focusing your compliance efforts on. If you're down in the ouch sector, you could be wasting resources when you should be monitoring the POW and the expletive up in the upper right-hand corner. Or if you want to use a specific example, you might be familiar with the ENISA. Who's heard of the ENISA? Well, they're European, so you're forgiven. But this is emerging in the compliance world as one of the definitive documents. I recommend you check it out. The ENISA is the European Network and Information Security Agency. They've given a lot of presentations around their risk map, and they've been pushing an agenda around awareness of threat modeling. Another reason that might be unfamiliar here is because they use the ISO so much more outside the United States, and the ISO starts with this threat model approach. It's really useful in compliance because I will tell you, if you get into executive boardrooms and start talking about your compliance strategy, they will take it back to, why do we have to do this? Remember reaching under the seat? Is this because we're told to do this? We're going to be in violation of law? Is this because there's an opportunity here? So if you use a threat map, you can say, well, it's because of this loss. We're going to lose this opportunity, we're going to lose this money, or because it's required by law. So the ENISA says there are 3 things that have the 7 rating. They put the numbers in the boxes to help illustrate how the severity ranks. So 8 is the upper right, 7 is just below, and then there's a 6. The 3 that are in the 7 box, they say, are loss of governance, lock-in to the environment, and the insecure and incomplete data destruction, or deletion. I do a presentation on forensics in the cloud, actually, and I find this somewhat amusing because it's really hard to get data. If you're doing forensic investigations, it actually is pretty hard to get data preserved in the cloud environment. So for one of the top threats to be that you don't get your data deleted is kind of ironic to me, because on the one hand, we're trying to save all the data logs to make sure that everything's saved forever, make sure we get good image quality, and it changes so much because you can't do bit by bit anymore. You used to take a drive and do bit-by-bit copies, which is a physical exact copy of the drive. If you do forensics now for compliance purposes or in a breach in a virtualized environment, totally different, because that data is spread across hundreds or millions or however many sectors, and you're basically taking a volume image and addressing it with a new instance. So completely different technology, same concepts, but everything that used to be used in court of law is going to have to change. So insecure and incomplete data deletion is a very interesting area to look into. Okay, so let's talk about addressing concerns. We know we have our vulnerabilities, we have our threats, right? So now what are we going to do for the countermeasures? So it's detection and mitigation, the 3 and 4 parts of our threat model approach. I would make the case that nothing's changed first, because it's easy to say that everything's different in the cloud, but that's sort of like saying, the input is different. Like you eat food, so you're eating a different meal. It's breakfast instead of lunch. But the tools we use are the same. We still have chewing, we still have taste, flavor, right? So a lot of this is going to be different, but we're going to use the same approach. So I would say you're still going to go and say, where's the data? Is it protected, and can you prove it? Sort of what we talked about in the beginning. In other words, if you use the toast example, are you going to get good toast or are you going to get burned toast? Because when you walk out of a provider and you say, okay, we're going to use these guys, you want to know if the compliance you're going to get is going to give you a good result. And if I can go on a little bit longer with my sort of silly analogy, again, toasters are not that safe. So here's a toaster that actually was just banned by the Consumer Product Safety Act. It actually causes substantial risk of injury. And this is only like a year old. So you can see the warning label that came with it. It's not that helpful. It says, to interrupt toasting, turn toast color control to off. Do not push the toast lever. It should have said something like this. If you use a toaster, it can burn toast and everything around it. It'll burn down your home. So when you use this cloud provider warning, we might destroy all of your data and never give it back to you, right? That's the sort of warning you might get when you think of commodity. But in reality, that's not what's going to happen. People aren't going to say, oh my God, you're going to burn down your home if you get into our cloud environment. They're going to say, hey, we're compliant with some standard. And that's what we're trying to move towards. And I do want to make this point because of the security versus compliance debate. People ask me all the time, and my answer is security is an individual approach and compliance is shared. So again, why do you want to be compliant? Do you respect authority? Do you have a shared view? Or are you in control? If you're in control, you'll do whatever you want. You might build a lock however you want. Maybe it's a safe lock, maybe not, but no one else gets to look at it. At some point you might say, I have the respect of my peer. I think there's a smart person. He or she can tell me if I'm doing a good job. Hey, come take a look at this. And then you agree, okay, if we do this way, it's a better lock. That's when you get the ANSI or the BHMA or Underwriter Laboratory. So that's the difference now. We're going to talk about compliance more than security. So that means that you're going to meet or exceed requirements of some specification, policy, standard, or law. And another way of looking at it is, if you did this just for security, you would probably come up with the same list or similar list. You would look at your management, you would look at network security, you'd look at identity management, remote access, right? Databases, backups, but you would never get to certifications and accreditations. So that's sort of where, no matter what, no matter how good a job you do with security, you're still lacking some other standard that says you've done a good job. And that's where we get into something like the SAS 70. Everybody's favorite whipping boy. People love to beat up on the SAS 70 because it's actually pretty old. And I remember working with SAS 70 in the early days, because I may be older than I look, but when we worked with SAS 70, back then it was like a novel idea. Same with HIPAA, right? HIPAA came out in 96, 97. And back in the day, it was like amazing. Like you could tell somebody what to do, because before then you couldn't. They would build whatever system they wanted to. So just to have the ability to say, here are 4 control objectives, are you thinking about them, was like a big thing. Today, it looks ridiculous. You look at PCI and you can say, turn off SSL v2. It's like you can be so prescriptive. So I would say first, that caveat with the SAS 70. But when you look at SAS 70, let me make a note here. The SAS 70 is being replaced next year. It's being updated. I don't know if everyone's familiar, but it's being replaced with the SSAE 16, which is if you look at the bottom, it's the Statement on Standards for Attestation Engagements, number 16. And that's reporting on controls at a service organization. It's also going to be replaced with the International Standard on Assurance Engagements 3402. And this is kind of a formality, but the ISAE 3402 is the international standard. The SSAE is the American interpretation of that standard. So for each country you might work in or work with, you'll get a different substandard under the ISAE 3402. Anyway, so you get into a SAS 70 situation, and there are 2 things you want to come away with. You want a description of controls, and you want control objectives. So in a cloud environment, when they tell you we're SAS 70 certified, what they've done is described their controls. They've literally written up, we have physical controls, we have logical controls, these are what they do. Then an auditor comes and looks at those and says, yes, you've described your controls properly. That's it. It really doesn't tell you much more than that. It doesn't have a list that you have to follow. It doesn't say you must have these certain things in place. No 12 domains, no 10 domains. So anybody can come up with anything. And you rely on the auditors and you rely on the providers to do a comprehensive job. So it's really close to security more than it is to compliance. That's the first step. It was really good for like 95, probably through 2000. But then we got into something, from HIPAA, which is now high tech, or has been updated by high tech. You get a little bit more language that says if you want to be HIPAA compliant, and this is specific, I would say, to a cloud environment, you need to do something like maintain record of movements of hardware and electronic media. Now, an auditor could interpret that to mean, show me where my virtualized machine has moved. Has it gone out of the country? Has it gone to a different state? Different states have different regulations for healthcare. Each one has a different requirement. I remember working in a retail environment where each state had a different pricing compliance requirement. So every time we moved data to a different state, we had to do a different compliance standard. In fact, we had a violation in Michigan that cost a lot of money. People that were buying things complained about how the pricing system, the information was being managed. So that ended up with the Attorney General, and there was a lot of compliance problems. So maintain record of movements if you want to look at 164.310D2.3. Access is another example. Only those persons or software programs that have been granted access rights should be allowed access, right? Remember the remote access? So we'll talk about that in a second in more detail. And then third, audit. So if you look at VMware Cloud Service Director, for example, it provides you something like role-based access control. So when you look at 164.312, you can say, okay, show me in the Service Director how you're managing the roles, what you're doing for access to the data within the cloud environment. And that would be an example of how you audit this environment now, specific to VMware. So they can have roles set up originally that come with the system, or they can build their own roles. So you might think nurses, doctors, etc. Let's look at PCI for a second. You have several requirements that bring out cloud-type language again. 2.4 says that the hosting providers have to protect the hosted environment and data. So be encryption, for example. 8.3 says two-factor authentication is required for remote access. I've had a lot of discussions around this. Can you get around this? Is there any way to avoid this? Does it have to be two-factor? What does two-factor really mean? This is a huge area in cloud, right? Because basically everything is remote. There's very little direct access. So everybody's using VPN, everybody's using SSH. What do you do to get to this level of access for PCI compliance? 8.3. Centralized log server. And 2.0 is coming out. 1.2 is the current version, but 2.0 is coming out in a month or two. And the requirement 10 is going to change. It's going to be merged with 11. One of the things that's changing is the requirement to do centralized logs for systems is going to be added to applications. So all applications are going to have centralized logging capability in order to be PCI compliant. So within a cloud environment, you have to have a centralized log strategy if you're going to be compliant. You basically have to have something within that environment which can collect all the application logs, all the system logs, and then show you who has access to those logs, shows the integrity of those logs within that environment. And there's some product offerings here. I tend not to promote or flog them, but LogLogic is one of the companies we worked with quite a bit, and they have a virtualized log interface now. And a lot of the SIM providers in the past had appliances that are hardware-based, and they talk a lot about performance because you have to get a certain amount, again, back to rate and dropping, they have to get a certain amount of performance out of that hardware. Move into the cloud, you're going to have to ask your SIM provider if you have an investment, okay, I want to do all of my logging in that environment, or I want to do all the logging across my environment, outside the environment. So how do I set up a VPN with enough traffic capability to pull all the logs? Yeah, you have a question?
So in this kind of example, in order to comply, would QSA sit down in your console and actually say, show me firewalling that is separating systems? Or do you just give them paperwork that says we have it? How deep do they go to prove compliance?
Well, I'm a QSA, so I can tell you what I would do. We require screenshots. We require access sometimes, sit down with somebody. We don't have to get on the systems ourselves, but there has to be regular testing. So you not only get the screenshots of the interface, as well as sitting down with someone and walking through them, but you also would run an assessment that would then map back. So if you say these ports are open on the firewall, you then run an assessment outside the firewall that show you which ports were open, and then you confirm. So 3 approaches. Oh, I should mention at the bottom of that too, you see if I can go back. There we go. Service providers are responsible for the security of cardholder data if they process it, or if they possess it, sorry. So this also gets into contractual language. Talk about that in a second, but keep in mind that even though you're handing things over to them, HIPAA changed too with high tech. It used to be that there was a business association relationship, so if you had data handled by another provider, Google's a good example of this. They were doing a lot of healthcare-related work for people. And as this business relationship was set up, they didn't have to be HIPAA compliant. Only the people who were a hospital had to be HIPAA compliant, and they were a business associate. But with high tech, that changed. Now they had to be HIPAA compliant as well. So as soon as you get into a cloud, Google's the cloud, they give you all these services, now they have to be compliant with HIPAA. Well, good luck, right? You have to have auditors go into the cloud, pull this data. So when you get into cloud environments today that might not have a compliance requirement, think ahead that you may want them to be at or better the level that you would have to be, you're not really getting away from the responsibility for protecting the data. The language in PCI is more future-looking, so it wrote in specifically, it's much newer, I should say, and future-looking, but it wrote in, if you give the data to someone else, they have to be at the same or better level. And so a lot of times I've been doing an assessment and I find, oh, wait a minute, as a QSA, these people are doing this processing for you? Well, there's a new assessment for me, right? Let's get a relationship set up, let's go through them. Or they have to have a QSA already doing that assessment. So there's a lot of that comes up in cloud compliance. So let's dig in a little bit with VMware. The vShield security appliance gives you quite a bit of capability around PCI DSS now. So the orange represents the slices, really. So you have a whole, but you're really trying to break it down. So within the environment, a virtualized environment, which might look like maybe you just have the virtualized data center, one whole, you still have to break it out. And as the keynote presented, you can see that you can do it by application now. You can do it, so you can do security of the applications. You can do it by the operating systems. So you can firewall using vShield the different systems from each other. You can firewall the applications from each other. So you can basically do things like NATing at the VDC. So there's a lot of opportunities now. Back to the toaster example. The commoditization was cool at first, but now we need more and more GFCIs, things that are outside the toaster that protect the toasters. So we're moving towards that with compliance. So you can see that at the edge level, that's just the old compliance test. The new test is inside the virtualized environment. Okay, so let's pull it back together. We had the threat, we had the risks and concerns we were talking about, and then we were talking about how we're going to handle compliance when we look at these different standards. I recommend using the ISO 27002. So 27001 is the Information Security Management Standard that handles how you manage security. 2 is the list of controls you would use. Another question?
Yeah, just on the previous slide, we ran into that problem where the QSA said you can't co-host applications on the same server, and they didn't understand virtualization. And it seems as if the PCI laws have to move a little bit with the time to understand that you can't co-host on the server because you're exactly using vShield separate.
Excellent point. So I'll take the controversial stance of the opposite. My theory on this is that clouds have to catch up to the standards. Usually it's the other way around. Usually you say audit standards are 5 years behind because auditors really are just trying to do a baseline. They're trying to do the bare minimum. If you're not doing the bare minimum, something's wrong. So they're not trying to move you into like bleeding edge future compliance standards. They're talking about like, here are the basics. But in cloud, it's been a little bit different. It's kind of like DOS versus Windows 7, right? So DOS was really simple, but over time, there are a lot of things that developed to help with compliance. It was single user, now it's multi-user, for example. There are logs, much better now in 7 than there were. There were none in DOS, really. So the technology has to adapt to some degree to comply with what's required for auditing. And in the case of the cloud, that's an example. And a QSA might say to you, like, you can't do this. But if you can come up with a technical solution that addresses their concerns, right? If you can find that GFCI outlet, they say, this toaster isn't safe. It could blow up any minute. You go, wait, I have an outlet. It's safe, right? It might try to blow up, but this thing will turn it off before it gets too hot. Bandsaw is another good example. There's this debate right now around these bandsaws. There's a guy, a scientist, who developed a system that can detect whether your finger touches a bandsaw so quickly, it'll shut the blade down. So there will be no more injuries with bandsaws. It's not the bandsaw itself that's being changed, really. It's being this technology added to the bandsaw that allows it to be secure. So if QSAs tell you in a compliance standard that, or in a standard way for compliance, you cannot do virtualization, there's a responsibility where you say, well, what if I do this or what if I do that? Is there something else I can do that will get me to the segmentation required? Or you can find a QSA that will, that's one of the things about audit. Sometimes you can find a QSA that is more up to speed with virtualization. That is a problem. Yes?
Regarding storage, previously for forensics, you could take a hard drive and actually recover stuff that was on the hard drive but was deleted. But in the virtualized world, how do you do that in virtualized storage?
I have a whole presentation about that. We can talk about it after. But the short answer is it depends on the environment you're in, but you can take an instance and snapshot it, and then you take that instance down, replace it with another one so it's running again. That's the first priority usually is people to get operations back, so you can replace it. But you take that snapshot, make another snapshot of it, and then do forensic work on the snapshot attached to the data that it used to be attached to. But you're working with the snapshot. That's the best we have right now. There's a whole series of questions around what will be admissible in court, which is different. I'm not a lawyer, but I can tell you the tests that you would need to go through. So for example, chain of custody, right? And then when you get into the approach you take, is there a body of knowledge? Has it been tested? What's the error rate? So there are no answers to that right now. So the body of knowledge is very small. There's not a lot of established error. People haven't shown how many times this approach will fail. So things like that are not on your side, but that's the approach. And I can talk to you about the details in the presentation. So in the ISO, if you map the threats on the left, let's just say we want to take not only the top 3, but all of the top threats, and we want a compliance approach to address those threats. Here are the ISO controls specific to cloud threats. So now what we're saying is, okay, the ISO is great for standard environments, but if you want to get into a cloud provider environment, what controls do you need to be compliant based on the threats that are most important? So we'll take a couple of those as an example. Loss of governance. You can use the ISO standards 6 and 15, so Organization of Information Security and Compliance. And if you get the provider to show you their ISO A6 and A15, then you'll know how they're addressing the loss of governance. And so for an example, you can have a checklist that would say, do they allow you to do independent security assessments? Do they allow you to get full and detailed logs? Can you download them? Are they available long-term? Access to incident information. Maybe you are allowed to do your own forensics in that environment. So how they answer the ISO is going to tell you how you're going to address the threats, the highest threats in a cloud environment. Another example is the R3 lock-in. So the ISO 7 is about asset management. You can avoid lock-in if you can get something like how they handle their asset inventory, who has ownership of those assets. They will specify in these, if you get the ISO statement from them, whether or not you can take your information with you. Classification of information. This one's probably more interesting. On the bottom right, I've tried to illustrate the common problem that I see in a lot of cloud environments. So they'll give you segmentation at the first level. They'll talk about how the network is segmented. You've got firewalls, everything's split up. Then they'll start talking about the processing, how it's split up. But it's in the provider's interest to try to keep things as consolidated as possible or commoditized, back to that example. And what often happens is you end up with a shared storage space. So you have to figure out for your own purposes, is it necessary, in a PCI environment especially, is it necessary to segment the database? And is that possible? And then what would it look like? So in a lot of cloud environments, you could end up with lots of databases, but they're all treated as the same. You want to make sure that if you want to use them for, if you're talking about a cardholder environment, if you want to use them for something else, you still have to have them audited. So if you have hundreds of virtualized instances of a database, you want to make sure only some of them are used for the most sensitive information, because those are the ones that are going to have to be audited. Those are the ones that are going to get into this debate around what controls are necessary. So it'll cost you a lot less if you put controls around an environment that's much smaller, if you can isolate the data into a particular area. But ISO A11 basically talks about here are the 7 subparts of A11 that give you a breakdown of access to the operating system, access to applications, how they're protecting mobile and teleworking services. So the compliance standard for the ISO is going to give you that detail. Now you could use a SAS 70 and still use the ISO compliance standards. It's not prohibitive, or they're not mutually exclusive. You can ask for an ISO that includes everything that the ISO has. I mean, you can ask for a SAS 70 that includes everything in a SAS 70. So a little more detail on how it works for VMware. You can have 2 customers who are running 2 different applications, different operating systems, right? They have their own instances. These could be virtual data centers. These could be virtual systems. And then they're going to access them at the same time as the managers. And you notice here how the IPs all overlap, right? The 192.168 domain versus the 10.1. They're actually running both the same IPs, 10.1.1.1. And they have to keep them separate. VLANs, if you look at PCI, are not sufficient, so you can't rely on those alone. So you can use instead an organizational firewall or an application firewall. These are new products that were announced this morning. So with vShield, you can have that firewall that protects your environment from another environment, which would address directly a QSA who would say, you just have a VLAN, that's not enough. Show me what else you have. Show me a firewall. Show me a stateful firewall. Now you're moving up the stack to where you're showing that the attackers can't get from one environment to another. Incidentally, the reason that they said VLANs are not sufficient was because of the wireless debate. So people were using VLANs, and there were attacks coming through wireless that were easily hopping. And so they provided guidance in between the compliance standard, in between 1.1 and 1.2. Wireless guidance came out that said you cannot use VLANs. So when a QSA starts talking about the requirement 1.2, it's not specifically in there that it says you can't use VLANs. It's in the guidance around wireless that you can't use VLANs. So from a compliance standard, you could argue that you're using VLANs, but ultimately it's up to the QSA and their reputation. And I don't think anyone's going to stake their security credentials on a VLAN as sufficient when it's so easy to break through VLANs. So that's why you're getting these, again, the GFCI toaster. That's why these new technologies are coming out that you should be looking for or you should be thinking about to implement in order to get the security you need. So that's the meat of the presentation. Let me draw to a conclusion now what I think are the key takeaways for this. So first of all, the extension of insiders. Cloud compliance is really not that new. It's something that's always been around. So we have an insider attack as one of the top threats. And when you move into a cloud environment, you're redefining who is an insider. You're giving away a lot of control because just like any provider, when you're outsourcing, you're saying this person now has additional rights. And I've worked on some breaches. I've done some tests too, where I found that a lot of times people treat insiders, even though they're outside the company, as though they have the same philosophy, as though they have the same idea of control. This really breaks down in some international situations. I've found, for example, people working in an offshore location are running scripts in a way that nobody within the company might have thought would be safe. I had a guy recently describe to me, actually, that in India, privacy is a different concept. It doesn't exist. You can just completely move data wherever you want, and so it's like not an issue. This was published in the news after a big breach. They're talking about how it's so different there. And of course, this raises issues around if you're treating that person as an insider, but you're not giving them the speech around what compliance means. You're not allowed to look at this data, then you have a problem. And you're allowing those providers, cloud providers, to manage your data, access your data, you can run into some serious problems. In the case I was talking about, the guys were dumping all of the most sensitive data using a script into a directory for convenience, and then they'd run analysis on that local directory instead of running the analysis using the system they were given access to. So you have to ask yourself, are you allowing people with these management interfaces to download the data, take the data out of the environments, run it locally, push the data back? Once they pulled it down, they left it in a world writable directory. So here you have this hugely sensitive server with world writable directories, dumping data into. So all I had to do when I was doing some tests and looking for it was look for a specific key. With the same thing an attacker does. You look for certain types of data. I found it. I opened it up. I not only found all the data I needed, which was a breach in itself, but I actually found the script which allowed me to regularly run and pull the data out of that environment. So it was a pretty bad situation, but that was because they had hired people, allowed them to be insiders, but didn't train them on the data practices, gave them a management interface. So you can see how you start to blend environments and you get some problems. You get this obfuscated location. Many providers won't tell you where the data is. But again, if you look at this new control released from RSA, they talk about now or EMC too, they talk about tracking data. So, take a look at that. Look at what control can you use, which will tell you the exact physical location, geolocation of your data at all times. Your virtualized instance, your cloud environment never leaves this geographic location. Pretty cool, right? You need that if you're going to worry about laws and regulations, state by state, country by country. So not only storage, but transit. Where's the data moving in the pipes? Management interface, super important, so as I talked about, but also not just because of power and things you can do, but also because it becomes additionally important for forensics, seeing what people did do. So you need to be able to pull all activity out of the management interface. And then finally, the hypervisors really are new. It's just new technology that has to be looked at differently. So it's kind of my illustration of the new hypervisors coming. You have to be ready for the hypervisors. So the other thing, I'm not a lawyer, but you can't get away from compliance talking about everything except for the law. So you have liability and transfer, and I saw a really interesting article recently where some lawyers were debating whether or not service level agreements even matter. Like, maybe you shouldn't focus on that because everybody always limits their liability. So limited liability contracts are kind of like a waste of time. It hasn't been settled in court. Courts always look for precedent. Since there's no precedent, this is all just like water under the bridge right now. Just let it go. Focus on controls. And one way of focusing on controls is insurance. Remember that map where you draw out your probability? So you have the likelihood of an attack, and then you have the impact of an attack. You could do a third dimension on that, which is transfer of or insurance against the attack. So take out a big enough policy or capital offset. If you look at Basel II, nobody in the U.S. talks about Basel II, but it's a big regulation in Europe for banks that talks about operational risk And if you can figure out your risk using this really cool, complicated formula, I think it was invented in Switzerland, so Basel II, you can expect it to be complicated, but it's like if you can figure out the formula, you can figure out, yeah, we have like $2 million of risk this year, so let's set aside $2 million in a CD or bank account, and then if anything happens, we've got the money to offset the risk. That's what should have prevented the financial collapse, incidentally. The Basel II Accord was supposed to help prevent a lot of that risk, but the banks weren't setting aside enough offset. So anyway, the idea is to be compliant, a lot of times you can look at it not only from what's the likelihood and what's the impact, but what's my ability to take care of that by having some offset. Another way of looking is if you do disaster recovery or you do forensics, you look at the recovery point and the recovery time. So how much do I have to recover in the cloud environment versus private, and when do I have to recover it by in order to continue my operations? So a lot of that liability and transfer within compliance is changing. It's kind of interesting in that area. Some of the countermeasures that are much more important, I think, in the cloud environment now are data sanitization. I borrowed this from PCI, but they're very aggressive around sanitization of data. So you can mask the data, you can wipe it out completely using secure wipe, you can hash it using cryptographic hashing, so people can't reverse it, or you can group it in some place and have controls around it so you can't get in there unless you have all these other access rights. But the bottom line is it used to be important within the private infrastructure, within an IT environment that you run yourself. Move it into a cloud, it becomes like 100 times more important. So if anybody, an auditor, a QSA goes into that environment, or even for HIPAA, you go into that environment and you start looking around at who has access, sanitization becomes like your best friend. So it's really important now. Data encryption, likewise. The end-to-end encryption model becomes like crazy important because I don't know if you followed this little breach for a restaurant in Austin recently. I follow a lot of the breach data because I give a presentation on the top breaches as well. But this little restaurant was complaining that Heartland had another breach, and the police officer was quoted who did the investigation in Austin as saying it was outside the restaurant. It was somewhere in the cloud. It was in the processing environment outside. We know it wasn't in this point of sale. And Heartland actually said the opposite. They said it was definitely in your environment. It had nothing to do with us. Well, end-to-end encryption takes this debate off the table. Because if they had put in place a system that took that data and encrypted it and moved it, then you could have said it had to have been the point of sale because nothing was available once it left the point of sale. It was encrypted. But since they didn't do the end-to-end encryption, Heartland didn't have the defense to say, well, it wasn't us. They're just saying, we don't think it was us, but we can't prove it. So the end-to-end encryption changes that debate entirely. It basically proves it has to be breached at the point of which the data was entered. It can't be breached if the encryption's working, if you're using sufficient key management, et cetera. There's a whole different debate there. But that's how it changes when you get into a processing or a cloud environment. You really change where your liability is and who's responsible, whether it's the provider, whether it's you. Segmented architecture kind of speaks for itself. So you have to have better segmentation controls around whose data is whose. Logical separation, we talked about, geographic, and then the physical presence of data. Showing that there's actually some physical location of data is kind of interesting. I did a data center audit where I did, I think, 4 data centers in 5 days, where I did, traveling around the country, and it was really nice because I could do a comparison. Each day I would look at a different data center and see what their controls were. So it became very apparent the differences between them, who managed them well versus who had the controls in place. But perhaps most interesting was some of them were cloud provider data centers. So I would go in to audit some small company, and right here was a cloud provider's rack behind me. And you might get an impression sometimes for physical presence of data that like the cloud is really separate from everybody else because it's the cloud, but really it's the same data centers. So if I'm auditing, Joe's restaurant's system that's a web server for his online ordering system, I might be standing next to the cloud provider that has billions of dollars of assets and, gaming environments sometimes. They take up 9/10 of the floor, and then the 1/10 is like everybody else's business, every SMB. So wrapping it up, you can really, if you use compliance properly, if you use the ISO standard, if you use some other standard, you can choose if you want, but I like the ISO because I think it's the most universal. You can start to compare these different providers, and you can say, okay, let's look at the cloud provider A versus B, and based on your threats for your own organization, because they're always different, you can decide which one fits your needs best. So here you can see somebody does A15 better than A8. Maybe media handling is more important to you, so you'd go with Cloud A, based on how they respond or how they answer the ISO questions you ask or what the report says. So the bottom line is that you can really get to trust. You can start to trust these environments using compliance because information security is great as a start, but it requires on management, and management requires on some baseline, which is given by compliance. So then you get audits, which give you transparency. And so the transparency and the audits really come back to security through this management system that gives you compliance. So if I look at the classical versus romantic approach, I can take either path, but at the end of the day, you still have a checklist. And whether you want someone else to present that checklist to you as your mechanic and say, your vehicle is safe to drive, or whether you go in and look at it yourself and do all the tests yourself, you're coming to the same end result. You're getting a sense of, is it safe because it's compliant with a checklist? And then you do it over again. So it's not something you're done with once. You have to keep doing it, just like you maintain a vehicle over time as you're using it. And at the bottom here, I have the Shewhart cycle, which was from the 60s and 70s, and it's used a lot in automobile manufacturing. But it's you plan first, then you do something, then you check to see if it's working, and then you act upon what you found by checking on it, and then you plan again. So you continuously do this over time. So hopefully at the end of that, you end up with compliance on the pro side. It's actually helping you in the cloud because you have now standards developing which are making clouds more compliant than you might have had before. That's what we're working towards. We're going to get better detail, better granularity in logs, better controls, better segmentation, so the cloud then becomes more attractive as a compliant environment than you might have ever been able to get in your own environment because you'll have more opportunity to use better controls. That's it. And don't forget to fill out the online presentation, or the online survey. I guess there's a survey for each presenter. These are the 3 takeaways they asked me to put up on the slide. Choose your approach, romantic or classic, figure out your controls, and then look for transparency so you can have compliance in the cloud. Thank you.